Abbeville Institute is an association of scholars in higher education that was formed a couple of years ago, and it's devoted to a critical study of what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. The Institute conducts conferences and seminars and an annual summer school for graduate students and college students. It also guides research and publication on all aspects of the Southern tradition, and books by Institute scholars are out on display on the table over there. The Institute is not a Southern heritage preservation, nor is it concerned merely with the history of the region. Its work is more philosophic in nature. What we want to do is explore the metaphysical image of things human and divine to which the Southern tradition bore witness, and insofar as it survives, still does. This includes a number of things, seeking to understand the value of those features of community that promote an enduring and humane order. The importance of place. Modernity has paid little attention to this. Place is important. The importance of private property. Piety and humility before the divine order of things in the universe. The importance of manners and social affairs. Classical liberal studies, and by which I mean Greek and Roman Latin literature. And the importance of a human scale to political order. Modern states have no notion of moderation in respect to size, either in the building of their cities or their countries. Now, we are interested both in what those values intimate for our own time, which would involve policy issues, and also in how they came to be features of the Southern tradition, which is a more historical question. So you might say the Institute has bifocal zone. If you tilt the glasses this way, we'll be looking at the principles, what is true and valuable. And those are timeless. They have nothing to do with the South. The problem of centralization in the European Union is just as interesting to us as the principle of centralization in the 19th century in America. But if you tilt the glasses another way, you see the Southern tradition. A real people, Americans, living in a place. You see magnificent things, you see the flimsy, the great, the noble, the cruel, as you do in any tradition. A tradition is a flow of sympathy, of ideas and sentiments that hold people together across generations. It contains all of those things I mentioned, and it opens out into an unknown future. And as Michael Oakeshott said, rationality in a tradition is exploring what is intimated in that tradition. There are things intimated that could go this way or that way, or this way or that way. And a tradition can reach a dead end. And when it does, it should back up and explore other intimations that might be more fruitful. But it contains intimations and dispositions to be explored. Now, why was the Institute founded? Well, why don't we just let the universities do this and colleges do that? That's what they're supposed to do. They explore traditions and all. Well, that's right. In a healthy society, that's what education is. It's the thoughtful enjoyment of a cultural inheritance, a critical, thoughtful enjoyment of a cultural inheritance, which is passed on to the young, and which they appropriate as their own in their peculiar circumstances. But America today is in the grip of an ideological culture war. During the last 30 years, colleges and universities have come to be dominated by the ideologies of multiculturalism and political correctness. And this spans my career. I watched it at the very beginning appear, and it has become quite unbelievable. The result is that the distinctly Southern interpretation of American history and identity is simply not taught. in colleges and universities in the United States and in the South. If the Southern tradition is mentioned at all, it is usually vilified as little more than a mask for racism. But it's better just simply to ignore it. In ignoring or eliminating the Southern tradition, much that is good and noble in American life is rendered inexplicable. And perhaps more importantly, one erases from memory a valuable intellectual and spiritual resource for exposing and correcting the errors of American modernity. Remember what I said about a tradition having intimations of various kinds to be explored and tested out. If you cut out one half of your tradition, you're performing a lobotomy on the intelligence of your tradition. And when you run into a dead end, you'll not have those resources to go back to know how to reorient yourself. Much of what we find to be reform, like the Reformation, or something new like the Renaissance, if you look at it, is really a going back to recover something that was for centuries suppressed or forgotten and reappropriated. Greek and Roman sculpture were reappropriated in the Renaissance. But Michelangelo was a Christian, and when he reappropriated those forms, they didn't look like Greek and Roman forms, but he couldn't have done it without that inheritance. Eugene Genovese, a distinguished historian of the South and a Northerner, and also a man of the left, he's not only a Northerner, he's from Brooklyn, and a man of the left, has been a rare voice in criticizing this purge of the Southern tradition from the academy. And I might say it's particularly bad in the Southern universities. You're more likely to find a thoughtful interpretation of the Southern tradition outside the South than you are to find it in the South. This is quite unbelievable. Southern people pay taxes and are very generous in their gifts to universities in the South, private and public, and they don't realize that there's just simply nothing there for Southern students. Genovese says this in his Massey lectures at Harvard a few years ago. Quote, rarely these days, these lectures were, by the way, on the Southern tradition. He was invited to give a series of lectures on the Southern tradition at Harvard. Quote, rarely these days, even on Southern campuses, is it possible to acknowledge the achievements of the white people of the South. To speak positively about any part of this Southern tradition is to invite charges of being a racist and an apologist for slavery and segregation. We are witnessing a cultural and political atrocity, an increasingly successful campaign by the media and an academic elite to strip young white Southerners, and arguably black Southerners as well, of their heritage, and therefore their identity. They are being taught to forget their forebears or to remember them with shame, end quote. This is not simply something that's going on in the academy. It's going on in both mainline parties, mainline churches, the media, and journalism. Now, this condition is not going to change overnight in the universities. Those who created it are tenured. They're not going to be fired, and no one wants to fire them. And it will dominate in higher education for at least a generation, and even longer, since the politically correct are disposed, quite naturally, to hire and tenure only their own. Even so, there are many scholars in America and abroad who are inspired by the Southern tradition, and many others who are open to what it has to teach. I found that students, too, are open. They feel that somehow they're entering on campus a profound intellectual and spiritual disorder, but they don't know how to think about it. What is needed is an association of faculty and students outside the university, but connected to it, where new questions can be raised and new lines of research pursued, so that new books will be written, different kinds of books with different kinds of interpretations. Students that attend Abbeville Institute events have a place where they no longer feel isolated. They can discover that they are faculty members with national and international reputations who have a different and more thoughtful conception of the Southern tradition and of its role in the still contested question of American identity. Armed with scholarly understanding and the lineaments of a different program of research, students can return to the university better able to engage in fruitful debate with their students and fellow students and teachers. We do it, as I said, we do an annual summer school. We do an annual seminar for academics, which we bring together scholars and graduate students to discuss topics and explore new programs of research and scholarship. We also provide speakers for campuses and civic organizations and Southern heritage groups as well, but we're mainly interested in higher education. When we talk about the Southern tradition, there's something a little artificial about that. The Southern tradition is simply the American tradition. But the problem is, there's not just one America. There are a number of Americanisms. What it means to be an American is a deeply contested notion. And as I said before, we're living in a culture war, and no one wants to live in a culture war. For one reason, culture wars don't take prisoners. They're zero-sum games, because they have to do with what things really mean. T.S. Eliot said, a culture is what makes life worth living. And if you have a war about that, then it's a pretty nasty thing. And I, for one, don't like to be in such wars. None of us do, especially Southerners who would much rather work and be with their families and let things go, which is one of their virtues, but one of their vices, because they have let things go. They have let things go. Universities have slipped completely out of the control of the culture because people weren't minding the store. People that had the resources weren't minding the store. Let me try to give you a different image of the Southern tradition. Let me try to picture it as America, or at least as an American tradition. The South, in the antebellum period, up to 1860, there wasn't a nation. There was only a federation, sort of like the European Union, though tighter than that. So there was no American nation. Someone once told me that James Buchanan was the last president of the United States, and Lincoln was the first president of the Union. We have inherited a fractured memory, like the French have. The French Revolution has fractured the memory of the French, and they've never gotten it back together. They've had to deal with the fracture. Now, I'm not saying the fracture wasn't there for a reason, maybe a good reason. I'm not saying there are not good things to be said of either side of the fracture. But a fractured memory is something you have to deal with. And it can be creative. Good things can come out of this dealing with two contrary elements in the soul. But there is a fracture. There is no such thing as the American founding. It doesn't exist. There are two American foundings, or three, or four. There's a Southern understanding of that founding. There's a Northern one. And there are others. And part of living in the adult world is to accept this. The British in Westminster Abbey have buried both Puritans and Royalists from the Civil War. They've had to come to terms with that fracture. The Civil War was every bit as divisive with long-term significance as the American war between the states. The English have come to terms with this in the way in which Americans haven't. Americans have simply buried one side of the fracture, have demonized it, and have presented the other one as the true and only side. And that there's something profoundly adolescent about that. And that's why I suggest there's something profoundly adolescent about American politics, its rhetoric, its style, its spiritual depth. It's adolescent. And that's true from Lincoln right on up. His rhetoric, though it has a certain charm about it, charm's not the word, it has a certain fetching character about it, it betrays the shallowness, I think, of a kind of adolescent rationalism. But I would have to spend some time defending that. We don't have time for that, but I'll just toss that out for you to ponder. Well, America was a contested notion in the antebellum period, not as a nation. It was an incipient nation, but it was a federation, mainly. After the war, it became a nation, or at least said it was a nation. But this nationalism that it developed into was the same thing that was going on all over Europe, right? We talked about this earlier, how an artificial nationalism was imposed on the French people by the government, and in Italy, and in everywhere in Europe, nationalisms were imposed of an artificial kind on the people of Europe. Metternich quite rightly said of Italy that Italy is a geographical expression. In other words, it's not a nation. Still isn't a nation. Just ask Marco Bassani and a Sicilian about the Italian people. From the ratification of the Constitution until 1860, let's look at who was running the Union. Take presidents. 11 came from the South, only 5 from the North. Attorney generals, 14 came from the South, only 5 from the North. Supreme Court justices, 17 were from the South, only 11 from the North. And this includes John Marshall and major founders of American jurisprudence. Speakers of the House, people judged by their merits and so on, 21 came from the South, only 12 from the North. When you thought of the South in this period, if you were, when you thought of America in this period, if you were European, for example, you had an image of Washington, Jefferson, Andrew Jackson. That's what an American is. Andrew Jackson won the Battle of New Orleans, which was the second most important battle in American history. Historians don't present it that way, but it was. And people knew it. They knew that had that battle not been won, the British might well have been managing the Louisiana Purchase territory and controlling the Mississippi. We forget how powerful the British were. I mean, we defeated them, we think, in the Revolution, but they were fighting every country in Europe at the same time. They were fighting Austria, France, Portugal, Spain. That was a sideshow. They simply quit because they were overextended. Again, 1812, they were fighting Napoleon. The thing with us was a sideshow. They had to pull out because they were overextended. Had the British not been overextended in the 18th century or during the Napoleonic Wars, it's very likely they could have pacified the region. It would be like Canada. Anyway, an American was a Southerner. You also thought of people like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone. It was Southerners that went west, not the Northeast. They're the ones that cleared the way. That's why when you go to Minnesota, there's Lake Calhoun. That's why the great novel about Wyoming is called what? The Virginian, not the Massachusettsan, because they were huddled on the coast pursuing commerce, which is not to be despised, but they weren't carving out a civilization in the West. And when the Southerners seceded, they brought this nation with them. They brought this understanding of what an American is with them. They brought Washington, Jefferson, all these people with them. And on their great seal, they had an equestrian statue of George Washington. He was the father of their country. And they were America. So there were two Americas. It was honest. Two unions. Two Americanisms, clearly. Two Americanisms, not a battle between North and South, where the South is trying to destroy the Union. That's how it's pictured. No, two Americanisms spontaneously developing over a period of time, just as you would think with a huge region like that. Why wouldn't you have two Americanisms? Why wouldn't you? Or three, or four. This means then that when we look at George Washington, we have to say that he would have been a Confederate. That Jefferson would have, had he lived into the next generation, would have been a Confederate. He died in 26, only what? 34 years before his state seceded, 5 years before his state seceded. That's not much time. Now, I can hear Professor Ross perhaps saying, well, Washington was a Unionist, as he was, of course, and all the rest of it. But people change sides on, as he's also pointed out, people change sides on that. Madison wrote the Virginia Report, which even Marco Bassani considers one of the great decentralist documents in American literature. But he doesn't think much of Madison, and he would agree with Professor Ross on that, the two-step and all the rest of it. Madison would have been a Confederate. I think Patrick Henry would have, George Mason would have. Now, they also were Unionists. Virginia had helped create the Union more than any other state. It had a long vested emotional interest in the Union and pride of place in it. Washington, had he lived into the next generation, and by the way, don't say, well, you know, it didn't happen, and you're just uttering counterfactuals. History is made up of counterfactuals. There is no understanding in history without establishing counterfactuals. What would have happened if so-and-so hadn't happened. A history without counterfactuals has no significance. There's nothing wrong with counterfactuals if you have good reasons for them. If I take a match, I say, you see this match, and I take a hammer and pound it to bits, and I say, if I hadn't done that, and if I had struck it on this box, it would have ignited. Yeah, but it's gone. I know it's gone, but if I hadn't done these things, it would have ignited. Do I have any good reasons to say that? You understand? Yes, I do. And if you deny that, you're denying causal laws. So what would have happened is Washington would have been opposed to secession in 1860. So would Jefferson, so would Madison, so would Patrick Henry, so would George Mason. So was the legislature of Virginia in 1860. And they voted to stay in the Union after the Confederacy was formed. North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas said, no, we're going to stay in the Union. But then Mr. Lincoln ordered an invasion and ordered those states to supply troops to invade those states further south and coerce them into the Union. And Virginia reversed itself and seceded from the Union, as did the other southern states. And so Mr. Washington would have voted to secede from the Union on those conditions. So would Jefferson, so would Madison, so would Patrick Henry, so would George Mason. They would have worn Confederate gray, and I don't know that Washington would have done any better than Lee, but that's where he would have been. All the evidence points to that. Washington, you know, you can say he was loyal to the Union. He was, but he was loyal to His Majesty too. He was loyal. He was a loyal British subject. So was Jefferson, a loyal British subject. But their loyalty had limits. They valued liberty, and their loyalty was, after all, just to a government. If that government went beyond its bounds, they would act appropriately. Now, notice how hard it is for us to entertain this thought experiment that Jefferson is a Confederate, would have been a Confederate. What's happened is we've accepted this nationalist theory that the Union's one and indivisible, that the South just tried to destroy the last best hope on earth for no other good reason than to enslave human beings. This is the story that's taught. It's just that adolescent. You can make it a little more sophisticated if you're James McPherson or Eric Foner. I won't say Eric the Red Foner, as some of my friends say, but you can make it a little more sophisticated, but that's really the postulate. simply not true. It's a good story, but it's not true. Now, there were those at the time who understood this. You've got to remember, Lincoln only got a little over a third of the vote. There was strong Northern resistance, which he put down ruthlessly, suspending the writ of habeas corpus, closing down some 300 newspapers, using the military to get elected in '64, turning war against civilians. Hard to resist that sort of thing. But after the war, Herman Melville wrote some poems about the war, and in one of them he points to this fractured memory that I've been talking about, that we have to deal with, and which Americans don't deal with, haven't even begun to deal with it. The only thing they can see is that slavery was eliminated, but nothing much else. The poem goes this way, quote, "Who looks at Lee must think of Washington. In pain must think and hide the thought. So deep with grievous meaning is it fraught. Must hide the thought." Melville sees that Washington would have been a Confederate, and that Lee was Washington, and Washington was Lee. That's the continuity of America from a Southern point of view. Melville understands there are two Americanisms. Now, we might add there's a third one. I'll just call it cultural Marxism. Sometime around the 60s, America progressively, the cultural Marxist idiom, never mind how it came into America, is firmly established. John Gray, a friend of mine and a political philosopher at the London School of Economics, wrote an essay in which he said America is the left's last utopia. The left was always looking for a utopia, Soviet Union in the 30s, China, and I mentioned that Castro was looking to Cuba. Students in Sweden, right before the collapse of the Soviet Union, were finding it in Albania, of all places. So there is where the revolution is really being worked out. But Gray argues the left now looks to America. The left has made its peace with capitalism. That's not a problem. In America, the left flourishes, he thought, better than any place else in the West. Well, that's cultural Marxism. That's a different kind of Americanism, and there are Americans who are cultural Marxists. So we have three kinds of Americanisms: a Jeffersonian Confederate Americanism, a Lincolnian nationalist Americanism, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, the neoconservatives, and then we have a cultural Marxist Americanism. They're utterly incompatible as ideas. But remember what we talked about in terms of colors. Primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, in the real world intermingle, and they create different colors. And so these idioms and styles of life in America, the Jeffersonian idiom, the Lincolnian idiom, and the cultural Marxist idiom intermingle, and it's very bewildering. But that's who we are. Our souls have those tensions in them, and we feel the pull of all of these, even the cultural Marxist one, at least to the point where we submit to it if we don't actually believe in it. We're silent in the presence of it. So the Abbeville Institute is interested in exploring this fractured memory historically and philosophically, and we're interested in the question of American identity. And the Southern tradition grounds one fundamental conception of American identity, and it's incompatible with these other sorts. So there needs to be a new kind of scholarship, a new kind of history written of America, one that acknowledges all of this straight out. And there are four books. If you do that, you have to question fundamental assumptions of American historiography. For example, one assumption, a moral postulate of all American historiography after 1865, is that the Union should have been preserved at all cost. That's just not questioned, any more than the Ptolemaic theory was questioned when people thought that the Earth went around the sun. You just looked at the world in the light of that postulate. But Copernicus said, well, you know, it might be the other way. It might be that the, what did I say, the sun? No, right. Did I get it right? No, I got it wrong. Yes. No, the sun goes around the Earth in the Ptolemaic theory, and Copernicus asks us to entertain the postulate that, you know, it might be the other way, that the Earth is going around the sun. Let's try this postulate out. And by the way, Copernicus had no evidence for this. All the evidence was the other way. Right? You can almost see the sun rise in the east and set. So it comes right around. There it is, right on schedule. So you almost see the whole thing. There's no evidence, except let's look at it this way and see if we can render things more coherent. Well, it takes time to render things more coherent. It takes time. It's only when a big web is built out of that makes sense out of a lot of stuff that you finally say, well, we're just going to believe now that the Earth goes around the sun. Suppose we entertain the postulate that the Union should have been divided in 1860. Should have been. That it was a good thing to have divided it. That's a moral postulate. What evidence is there for that? Well, we don't need any right away. We'll just start thinking that way and then go look and see what kind of research we can do. Because when you begin with a different postulate, you can see things you couldn't see before. You can raise questions that were not possible before. And if you can raise questions that were not possible before, you can get answers and therefore discover facts that never could have been seen. You can see possibilities in policy that you couldn't have seen before. So we want to reorient American historiography around questioning certain fundamental postulates that have guided it, and also political postulates, but I won't go into those. We don't have much time. So confronted with these three Americanisms, Jeffersonian Americanism, Lincolnian Americanism, and cultural Marxism, what are we to do? Well, the first question is to go to the depths of it and ask, who are you? Who are you? Who are your people? What tradition do you owe allegiance? And what rhetoric can you frame to speak to your fellow Americans who inhabit these other ideological frameworks? And there's I know no answer to these. I have no answer to these questions. But I'm saying these are the questions that we have to ask. And we'll see what comes of asking them. And the scholarship we have to develop in students, undergraduates and graduate students, is a scholarship that is governed by postulates quite different from the ones that we've inherited. Now, a little word about the Institute's logo. It's named in honor of Abbeville. Where's Abbeville? Abbeville is a little district in the western part of South Carolina. And Abbeville District was the first to call an assembly of the people, literally out in the open air, with barbecue and all the rest of it, songs, and to call people out as they did back then. They had political meetings, and people would come from all over the place because that was part of the entertainment, and they might stay a weekend even. They would hear political speeches and do business and all the rest of it because they were agricultural people. Abbeville District called an assembly of the people to consider the question of whether their state should leave the Union. Now, I consider this one of the most noble acts in American history. That is to say, if you take self-government seriously, and you believe in government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and you pay attention to the principles of human scale, then you would expect this sort of thing to happen from time to time. And if it could happen in a legal and civil way, that would even be better. You wouldn't have to have revolution. It could be done in a civil and legal way. And that's what they wanted to do. So they voted that a resolution to be sent to Columbia urging the state to consider the question of taking South Carolina out of the Union. So Abbeville for us is a symbol of this Jeffersonian Americanism. The Americanism that seceded from Britain, the Americanism of the Anti-Federalists, the Americanism of even the New England Federalists that wanted to secede or told the Union that if they didn't straighten up, there were terms for this Union. They were loyal to it, but only on certain terms. the Americanism of Calhoun, who raised his glass in a toast, "Gentlemen, to the Union, next to our liberty most dear." So we see Abbeville as a symbol of that Americanism. Not a Southern symbol, it's an American symbol. Unhappily, there are other kinds of Americanism. The tree is the Palmetto Tree. The British came to Charleston about the time of the disturbances in New England to take the city, and the people of Charleston hastily threw up a fort on Sullivan's Island made of palmetto logs, which were easy to take down, and the fort was made of sand, palmetto logs filled in with sand. The British ships got within about, I've been to the place, it seems to me about 100 yards, and let loose on the little fort. And the logs didn't splinter. Had they been made of oak, they would have splintered, the sand would have poured out. It'd be bad news. This was thrown up rather quickly. The palmetto tree is not made of wood, as ordinary trees are. It's like a pad of steel wool, a Brillo, a Brillo pad. It's just a mesh of fibers. So it just sagged and held the sand. And then the fort replied and did considerable damage to the British Navy. They started running aground at low tide, and they had to hightail it back to England. So here the vaunted British Navy could not get into Charleston Harbor, and the trade went on. So we see that as the tree of liberty. You know, there are trees of liberty, oak trees, huh? Well, there's a palmetto tree of liberty. How do you like that? And Mr. Gadsden, right down the road from the old exchange, where we were last night, designed the flag, "Don't tread on me." There's a South Carolina rattlesnake ready to bite you if you come in. The tree, you'll notice, is deracinated. And that symbolizes a number of things. One is we want to get down to the roots. Trees, they're beautiful trees, huh? But they have roots in the soil. They're rooted, and there's stuff underneath. They're spiritual and moral postulates, as it were. They're principles these trees are rooted in, the trees of civilization. And we want to look at them. We want to look at the postulate, should the Union have been preserved at all costs in 1860? It's a moral proposition, not an historical one. Is that true? Maybe it isn't, but let's look at it. So we want to look at the roots of Americanism. Americanisms, I should say. Also, the tree can be seen as uprooted. It'll die if it's not rerooted. So we may need to transplant the tree. These are things we're trying to do, and we hope that you, students, will want to participate in this, and we hope that you'll not simply come to this summer school, for example, and leave. We hope you'll have a long-term relationship with the Institute and its faculty. If you want to go into academics, if you want to pursue a profession of that sort, it's important that you get advice from people who are actually in the academy. And so we have about 40 scholars whose resources we can draw on. So if you're interested in pursuing a program of study or something, you can call one of us up. And if we don't have an answer, we'll try to find someone that does, that can help you out. We can also perhaps help in letters of recommendation and in getting fellowships, grants, and the like. So we want to be a source of learning and fellowship for people who are interested in rethinking some things along these lines. Thank you.